This presentation is about managing the project stakeholders. Now, before we go into talking about stakeholders, let's define who the stakeholders are. And if you turn to page 6 of the book, of the textbook, the Managing Projects Large and Small, you have a pretty good definition of who the stakeholders are. Stakeholders are any and all of the people who have a vested interest in the project's outcome. So it's also anyone who might express judgment as to whether the project is a success or a failure. So that includes project team members, obviously, but also in terms of the kind of organization that you're involved in, members, volunteers, customers if you're offering some services, obviously the management team for the organization. It could be if you're subject to some regulatory constraints, or some other forms of legal constraints, those elements, those people. So it can potentially be a large number of people, and obviously the beneficiaries of the project, as well as those who might suffer some negative consequences from the project. So all of these are stakeholders, and it's important to have a strategy to deal with them, because they, if you think about the profile we just mentioned, they can make life easy or difficult for a project. So why do a stakeholder analysis? Well, to start with, identify all the stakeholders, again, people who impact the project or are impacted by it in any form, in any particular way. Then to kind of identify trade-offs between, maybe helping some stakeholders to mitigate some negative consequences or whatever. Obviously, the fourth point in that slide is to minimize surprises. You want to, this is one of the most important things of project management, is to try to anticipate as much of what might happen as possible. To also understand how to maximize your influence, again, picking up on what we talked about last week, and ultimately to optimize your use of energy. If you do not do a stakeholder analysis, then you might be going all over the place, trying to influence or deal with everybody, when in fact only some of those stakeholders deserve attention. So how do we develop a stakeholder strategy? Step 1, we identify all the major project stakeholders, and that's a good team building exercise where you can brainstorm in with the whole team. And when you do that identification step, start with a long list. Get everyone you can think of, and then you will pare it down as you go. But at the beginning, it's okay to have more rather than fewer stakeholders, so that way you're sure you don't forget anyone. So then the second step is to analyze each of the stakeholders according to whether they're interested in the project or not, what their motivations are, what their interests are, and also, most important, their relative power and influence position in terms of how they can affect the project. You also want to think about potential coalitions between stakeholders, people who would sort of work together in support or opposition to the project. And based on this analysis, then you set a strategic direction for each group of stakeholders. So, and as a result of that strategic direction then leads you to developing a set of actions in terms of communication, meetings, documents to share, information to share, etc. So, step 1, once you've done that whole long list of stakeholders, is to split them into what I call the primary stakeholders, who are those who stand to gain or lose or affect or are affected by the achievement of the project, of your goal. These are the immediate stakeholders, if you will, the one directly gaining, losing, affecting, etc. as a result of the project. They have a direct impact on the survival and success of the project outcome. And then the secondary stakeholders are people further out who can influence the primary stakeholders and get them to act in one way or another in support or in opposition to the project. So we like to, or to develop that strategy, we distinguish, or we define two dimensions. One is the degree of influence of the stakeholders, and the other is their level of support to the project. Degree of influence, that includes understanding their capabilities, responsibilities, skills, resources, interests that are relevant to the project. Then we want to know if they can influence other stakeholders, if they have credibility with others, if they are skilled at influencing others, if they are willing to influence others. You know, you can see here that some of the material we covered in the influence discussion last week is relevant here. And then the second dimension is the level of support. How supportive are they of the project? How supportive are they of you as a project leader? And what are the main reasons for their support and opposition? I put the second bullet, how supportive are they of you as project leader, because let's not forget that in every organization there is always a certain element of personal, a certain personal dimension involved. Some people, for whatever reasons, are not going to help you because of the relationship they have with you, and others will help you. And it's always important to understand whether that support is there. Personal support as well as support for the project. Having then defined those two dimensions, you can draw up a table like the one on the slide number 6. 2 by 2 with the influence on the vertical axis and the support on the horizontal axis, going from low support to high support, low influence to high influence. And then you can place the stakeholders in the appropriate quadrants. And again, this is part of the work that you're doing with your team, so it also plays a team building. There's a team building element, element to that exercise. Whether a stakeholder is classified as high or low for influence or for support is a matter of judgment for the team, and there will be some agreement and some disagreement, but ultimately you have to decide where, in what quadrant that stakeholder goes. So then you've got those 4 groups. So let's start with the easier one, which is the top right. The top right, high support, high influence. This is a top priority group. You want to leverage their influence. You want to use them as much as possible, because they can make things happen because of their high influence, and they are behind the project, behind you. So what do? You want to have a very strong level of cooperation with them and have them cooperate with you. You want to keep them informed and engaged. You want to communicate and measure progress. You want to really understand how to leverage their influence. And whenever possible, you want to request their help and basically use their capacity to influence others. The bottom left is the exact opposite. These are people with low influence and low support. They don't really have a lot of weight in the organization, and they don't really care that much about the project. So they are a very low priority, but you cannot totally ignore them. So you want to monitor and manage them. your goal is to make sure that if they shift, if there's any shift in their influence or support, it does not go against the project. So you want to monitor them and just be aware, but don't invest much time or energy with that group. Then you have the other two, the upper left and the bottom right. Let's take the upper left first. These are the most dangerous people for your project because they have a very high level of influence, lots of power in the organization, and for some reason they don't like this project, they don't support the project. Maybe partly it's because they don't support you, but mostly they don't support the project. So just like the upper right group is a top priority, so is this one. Your means of action is to try to influence them to minimize the negative impact they can have on the project. So your goal is to somehow increase their understanding of the value of the project, offer counter arguments if they are opposed. You're not trying to remember what we had in a couple of weeks ago, but in influence, you're not trying to convert them to supporting the project. What you're trying to do is to make sure that they don't do things that are highly damaging to the project. So you want to take an incremental approach to sort of deal with arguments as they come, try to understand their view, try to, in fact, put yourself in their shoes. And when you can accomplish some progress, that, for example, move them from being very negative to being somewhat negative to being neutral, these are small wins. So, but mostly you want to stay on top of them, know where they are, know what they think, know what they want, so that again you can take action to minimize their negative impact. The bottom right group, people with low influence but high support, is an interesting group because, again, they cannot do much because maybe they are lower in the organization, don't have a lot of responsibilities, but they do like the project. They do want to see it succeed. So they are not top priority like the other two groups, but medium priority. You have to expend some energy with them. You want to involve them in the project to maintain their support because since they don't have a lot of influence, it could be that they will sort of fade away. They will say, well, we can't do anything about this project, so let's think about something else. So you want to maintain their interest in the project, their goodwill, their energy, by keeping them informed, reporting on what is working, but also, and that's an important part, you can use them as intelligent sources on resistance and opposition to the project. They are in contact with the top left people, with everybody else in the organization, and because they support the project, they can actually be a very good source of information as to what are the issues that are making some people not be happy or supportive of the project. So you can represent those four groups in a graph, as I've shown on the slide 8, where you can actually plot each stakeholder by how high or how low they are on each of the scales. So you get a scattered diagram like I've shown here, and again circled in red are the critical people that can really in effect kill the project, the high influence, low support. And the two big arrows mean that you want to use the upper right, the high, as the source of influence over those people on the left. That's the straight arrow here. Use those high support, high influence people to influence the low support, high influence group. But also you can sort of find ways, and that's the crooked arrow, the second arrow, is find ways to increase the influence of that bottom right group to kind of move them somewhere closer to, maybe the bottom part of the high influence, so that they can also have a little bit of influence on that group on the upper left that is likely to create the most damage to the project. So that's essentially how you want to create that map, out of which you can then develop a more specific action plan for each stakeholder or stakeholder type. So what are you going to do in a profile of a stakeholder? You want to understand what their goals are. And so in terms of an action plan, you can link the project objective to their own goals. Sometimes they're opposed to the project because they don't necessarily perceive the real goals of the project. And when you reframe the project goals in terms of the stakeholders' goals, you may find that there is in fact more of a common ground. What are their interests and needs? Again, you can sort of look for ways in which the project is actually supporting that. What are the risks and other kind of issues that the stakeholder is most concerned about? Well, maybe your project can address some of those, or you can show how your project plan is trying to mitigate those risks. You also want to understand what their communication and learning style preferences are, so that you can tailor your communication to their style, remembering what we discussed about the decision-making types a week ago, or last week, or 2 weeks ago. Who influences those stakeholders? Because you can always go to those who influence them to influence them. and who knows the stakeholder well? Because you can get insight on what makes that stakeholder tick, and again, then understand better what makes them take a particular position. And then from that, you can draw up what I call the stakeholder balance sheet, where you list the stakeholder on the right and have a number of elements written, and that the tool, the stakeholder strategy tool that is included, is essentially uses that. This is essentially how to put it, a reproduction of those forms in those tools. Again, here you are listing only the most important stakeholders, those who have the most impact on the outcome of the project. You also want to have a communication plan. Again, this is for each type of stakeholders. You have the A, B, C, D, the 4 quadrants, and then what are the element of information that each one needs, so that you can stay on top. And here's an example of what may be required for each type of stakeholder. Again, these are examples of tools that will help you with managing those stakeholders, and whatever you find most useful, you can adapt them to your own style. Now, there's a second way of looking at stakeholders, and it's in relation to again, the power influence, but also the impact of stakeholders on execution. Think of a project in which the project, let's say, is about a new way of delivering a certain service to customers. But once you've designed that new way, then some people are going to be in charge of the execution of that new way, of that new policy. So this is a different kind, some of your projects may have that element to it. So this is when the project develops a new service, a new procedure, a new approach, and then somebody else who is not necessarily part of the project is going to execute, to apply, to implement what the project has developed. Here again, you have then 4 types of stakeholders: those that are with high power but also high impact on execution, and then high power but low impact on execution, low power, high impact on execution, and low impact on execution. Let me give you an example which I have personally experienced. Working with a hospital, we had a task force made up of administrators, physicians, some representation from other functions, including nursing, but primarily physicians and administrators. And they developed a totally new procedure because of new technology that the hospital had acquired, on how to collect and record information on the hospital floors from patients. So they spent time, did a really thorough job, and came up with a new protocols. And then when it was put in place, very quickly they realized that nobody was actually using it. So when they went to inquire, they found that the people in charge of the implementation were the nurses, as is the case in for most things in hospital. And the nurses had very little input in developing the new procedures. So when they tried to apply them, they found that they were totally impractical. So that was an example of people on the bottom right. No, I'm sorry, the top left. The nurses were in group A. Low power, but high impact on execution. They were not consulted, or at least just marginally consulted, and therefore the outcome of the project, even though it was a good design from a conceptual standpoint, was not executable in the context of that hospital. So what you want to do in here is think about those in quadrant A. The nurses in my example are critical to the implementation of the project. They are the ones that make it work, even though they don't have a lot of power. So your whole strategy is to try and involve them as early as possible in the design and implementation of the project. In quadrant B, you have the people who are, high influence and high power, and these are the people who are going to make the project be a success in the design and the execution. Quadrant C are, low power, low influence, so they don't really need a lot of your attention. I'm sorry, as you can see, I think I switched the two. I think what I refer to as D in that slide is actually C in the diagram. So you ignore those who are low, and then you pay some attention to those who are low-high. But the key here is those in A, those who are critical to the successful implementation of a project, and who often are not sufficiently involved in the project design and the project development. So again, here is the type of action summarized in a graphic form on slide 14. And so that's basically it for this presentation on stakeholders. The next few slides are essentially a repetition of the decision-making type slides that we had 2 weeks ago. So I'm not going to go over that again because we already did, but I put it in here because it's very relevant to managing stakeholders, and therefore you now have it in 2 places. Okay, thank you very much.